that you're going to be recorded. Hi, sorry about that. We were organizing ourselves in the room before we let you guys in. So I apologize for the slight delay, and we are ready to roll now. So we are the Equine Assisted Mental Health and Equine Assisted Learning Resource Network Facebook group. For those of you who maybe are first joining us and aren't familiar. And this is the second of a series of panel discussions about the differences, understanding the nuances and the differences between equine assisted mental health and equine assisted learning. So we really want to make sure that you guys, if you want to continue to come back, join these panels. We're working on kind of deepening the conversation and deepening our own understanding of these nuances and differences. So please do join us as we can. So our aim on our Facebook group is to create a safe and welcoming space for people from backgrounds and all backgrounds and walks of life to share, brainstorm, discuss, problem solve, and learn together in community. So Jane Faulkner of the Equine Assisted Therapy Australia training organization is joining us as our moderator for this Facebook group, and Callie Walsh. So wave to Callie and Jane, there they are, and myself, Leif Hallberg. So for today's call, just a couple little housekeeping items for today's call and any calls you join us on in the future. Just make sure you keep yourself muted to avoid any of that background chatter. And then use the group chat feature on the right of your screen to make comments, ask questions. Callie does an amazing job, and Jane too, of noting down all the questions and making sure we kind of bring whatever we can back to the Facebook group for continued discussion after the live panels. Callie will also be facilitating a brief Q&A at the end. We are running a little late, so some of our panelists are going to have to jump off right at the hour. Some of them might be able to stay a little longer. Jane and Callie and I might be able to stay a little longer to help kind of answer some of those, or we'll bring them back over to the Facebook group. So now, with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jane, and she will introduce what we're doing today, our panelists, and help get us grounded and centered and ready to roll. So welcome. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah. Yes, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. So to start with, I'm just going to invite you all to arrive here and to settle in the space that you're at. So we've all got a different nervous system. We're all going to have a different way of supporting ourselves. Just going to give you a few invitations, and you can take the ones that suit you the most. So the first thing, I'm going to invite you to just notice the chair or the support that you have underneath you and behind you. And just to allow yourself to be supported by that chair. So notice the support under your sitting bones, notice your feet on the floor, maybe the back of the chair and how that supports you. As you're noticing that support, if it's comfortable for you, I'm going to invite you to just notice your breath. And then to notice your room. So to take a moment just to orient to where you are, to your space. Notice something within your room that might feel supportive for you in this call. And then notice the Zoom room. Notice the faces that are sharing this space with us this morning. And just take a look around at our community and the support that's here. And that we're all here with the same intention, to help people through this work that we do. And for me, that's really important that we all remember that that's why we're here. And for me, I want to bring that because today we're wanting to deepen the discussion. And I'm imagining from what I've seen on different Facebook groups and from being in the industry for a few years that this discussion can be quite polarizing, actually. And so I'm wondering if today we can be really open and curious, and whether we can have generous assumptions. So we can kind of assume the best from what someone's saying rather than jumping to a judgment or a quick conclusion. So when we jump to a judgment or a quick conclusion, it shuts down that possibility of us learning more and moving forward, actually, as a community and as people that offer this work. So my invitation is for you to remain open and curious, to notice what happens in your body and how certain things land for you, and to be curious about them, your reactions, your responses. And I guess my wish is to bring our most adults into these conversations. So what,
Hang on 1 second. I think somebody's not on mute, and there's some pretty bad background noise. So make sure to check and see that you're on mute. Thanks.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do now is introduce our panelists that are here today. I feel very blessed that you're here, panelists, and that you're giving us your time, and that you are kind of supporting this conversation to move forward, which I really feel we need in this field. So Kathy Alm is the Executive Director of PATH International. Kathy, if you want to give us a wave. And Veronica Lack is the founder and Executive Director of the Herd Institute. Veronica, did you want to? Thank you. Bettina Schultz-Joe is the co-founder and CEO of Natural Lifemanship. Bettina, if you could give us a wave. And then Nina Ekholm-Fry is the Director of Equine Programs at the Institute for Human-Animal Connection at the University of Denver. So welcome everyone, and like I said, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for offering your expertise and your knowledge and your experience to this discussion. So I'm going to hand over to Nina to start with.
Oh, wait a minute, the question actually.
Oh, sorry. So the question was, or is, does the current language accurately and adequately encompass the differences between services that include equines for human well-being? And today, as we were talking with the panelists, they may directly answer this question, and they may kind of deepen on from the content from the last group around this question. Thanks, Nick.
Wonderful. And as I get started here with our panel discussion today, just want to say I had a chance to look through the participant list and see so many valued friends and colleagues. And Jane, that was a really lovely intro for us to get started with. So we're talking about language. We're talking a little bit, in my opinion, about conceptualization. And what I mean by conceptualization is just how we position, how we think and talk and sort of place the interaction with the horse in the kind of service or services that we provide. And for some folks, the way we use language is not necessarily as important as the way that, you know, the organic practice sort of evolves. For others, depending on the structures that they work within, using precise language, using language that describes, using language that's accessible is even part of the ethics codes or the practice standard codes. These professionals are directed to use the simplest and most understandable language possible when communicating about the work that they do. So some folks here, especially our panelists who I all know very well and enjoy so much as part of my work and personal life, know that for instance, when I'm thinking about what we're talking about, which is sort of horses as part of human services, I personally don't even use the term industry or like a unifying word for all of it. And there's a couple of reasons why, because I think it helps me. Of course, I'm connected to folks who work in different ways, and I also provide some services in a more learning setting and others in a treatment or therapy setting. And I'm also an adaptive riding instructor and do some other things. But in some ways, instead of, I feel connected in this way, but I'm not so prone to use a single term or even call all of us a single industry, because it helps remind me that there are different parts and perspectives here. And what I'd like to do with the rest of my time is explore a little bit how kind of it might come off as more of a kind of binary, like having 2 points, but knowing that there's a spectrum of a mindset that we might employ when we think about people and horses, and we think about professional work with others in this sort of human realm. And again, no value comparison, but just so that we can start clarifying the larger positions or parts that we may come from. One of these parts, or could exist in one part of this spectrum instead of just a line, is the idea that the horse themselves is at the center of what we do. And from this idea of the horse, kind of literally in the middle, centered, also comes language that centers the horse, sort of horse therapy or horse facilitated or horse centered, that kind of thing. And here's also where we see, if the horse is the center, sometimes the words that come after the horse, such as therapy or therapeutic or something like that, may not be as important to that particular person who takes this sort of more horse-centered conceptualization. And so it's important that we kind of find within ourselves, where do I fit here? Is this how I think about the work that I'm doing? And does this fit within the profession that I might have? Or is my profession sort of has originated as a facilitator with horses and doesn't really have a counterpart without horses present? So that would be kind of one area that I wanted to highlight. The horse is the point, humans sort of come up alongside, and words matter perhaps a little less because it's about the horse. Another conceptualization may be taken more so by folks who have professions that have legal restrictions on them. And by that, I mean, in the United States, states offer licensure or give licenses to people and take them away. And you have certain responsibilities in those professions. There are also other professions who might not have another kind of credentialing, but also have very clear practice standards. In this view, so I'm going to put it over here, visual and kinesthetic. So over here in this view, what's in the center of the conceptualization is the human professional and in the skill that they're bringing through their training and through their work to the situation. It doesn't mean that humans need to be prioritized over horses. It doesn't mean that welfare or dignity or respect for horses is any less. It's not that conversation that I'm having. It is just the frame of how that person thinks of what they're doing. So for instance, I am a mental health professional, and this is an area where multiple professionals use psychotherapy to treat. And when we have a framework already, we know what psychotherapy is, what so-called bona fide psychotherapy is. We know that things you do as a psychotherapist has to rely on psychological theory. And we also have a lot of guidance from organizations like the American Counseling Association that helps us put words on how we should understand the animal interaction in that way. Same with our colleagues in OT and PT and speech language pathology, who are, not sitting here in this particular networking room, but are colleagues to other credentialed therapists. Here, the interaction with the horse is actually can be labeled a certain sort of category. And that category, per my work and others too, is as a treatment technique, not the horse, folks, but the interaction. I have about a couple of minutes left here because I'm keeping time. So the interaction becomes, it gets a word that fits into the structure of how that mental health professional should think about their work. Okay, so now we have two sort of nodes on a spectrum. And I think what facilitates the conversation that we'll take going forward as well is sort of identifying, where am I sitting here? How am I thinking and talking and acting around this, so that this whole area, this whole conversation doesn't seem like sort of shots in the dark and you know, where are people coming from, and it doesn't become an us versus them. It just becomes more of a, I'm clarifying kind of my space here, and I'm seeking words and structures that make sense for the responsibilities that I have, you know, in the profession or professions I hold, and that may or may not change depending on, you know, if you're what hat you're wearing, so to speak. In conclusion, in my final minute, for healthcare professionals, and folks know who they are. You know, you have master's degrees, you have doctoral degrees, you've spent a lot of time training in your human work. This tends to make sense, what I'm talking about. And it's our, you know, job to not only think about our own area, but also help others understand, how do we work? And that's again why I so rarely use a unifying term or a singular term, because I recognize that we all have units and ways of working that don't have to be squished together, or don't even have to take precedent one over the other, as long as we're clear about where we're coming from and where we belong, sort of also in larger society, laws, licenses, that kind of thing. I think that's what I wanted to start with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina. That was really, really helpful. Thank you. I'm just going to pop it out to the panelists about who would like to go next.
I would like to go next, unless Veronica also.
Go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Kathy Alm, the CEO of PAP International, and it's great to be here with you today. And I love this conversation. I am grateful that there is a space for this conversation, because I do think it's very important. And Nina, your conceptualization is I think a very helpful, useful way to frame this conversation, or at least part of this conversation. By the way, Leif, I have not timed myself, so if I truly do go the full 10 minutes, I'll need you to tell me. And however, what I think I heard you say, Nina, is that if someone's conceptualization is to put the horse at the center, they may not have words. Words may not be as important. And I guess that's what I wanted to jump off of, because I think regardless of where you are on the continuum of the conceptualization, words are critically important. And part of this comes from the work that I did for the industry. Sorry, Nina, I can touch on that if there's time, for developing some consensus around terminology. And Nina was a part of that. Appreciate that. I see Lynn Thomas. Lynn Thomas is square. Lynn was also a part of it. There may be other people on that were a part of it, but we pulled in people from all over, doing different types of services that incorporate horses, in order to get all the different perspectives, the different organizations, and try to get on the same page. And some of you, maybe all of you, know that we all then published a consensus document on terminology. And I think one of the most important points that came out of all of that work and that published paper is how important it is for us to be specific about the service we are offering. And that means whether you're part of a profession, you're offering psychotherapy, for example, or PT or OT, or sorry, I didn't mean to imply therapeutic writing instructors are not part of a profession. I meant a licensed professional. Whether you're that, or you are a therapeutic writing instructor or adaptive writing instructor, or you're offering equine assisted learning for organizations or in education or personal development, it is really critical that you are specific about what you're offering, because otherwise what we found when we first started that terminology work is our research is a mess. Our research is a mess because people use the same terms to mean different things, or they use different terms to mean the same things, and you can't aggregate the results because you can't pull them in order to find just studies on, excuse me, PT incorporating horses for children with CP. It's very difficult to do that. So we have all talked about how badly we want to raise awareness and credibility of the work that we do. And research is one way to do that. So we need to be speaking the same language in order to make sure our research is clear. We also need to be speaking the same language, or at least being specific about the service you're offering for the public, so they know what they're receiving. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat. So that the person is receiving the type of service they need. And because many of them will call a center and say, hey, I need horse therapy, right? Well, you need to ask a lot of questions to really figure out what it is that particular participant or client may need. And that's where being precise about the language, precise about what kinds of services you're offering is so very important. In terms of the that terminology work was just the beginning, where we got consensus on the big buckets of therapy with therapy first language, the big bucket of equine assisted learning, and the big bucket of horsemanship. There is more work to be done, but that at least started to help clarify what are the different services that people can offer. And as I think Nina said, how important it is to have that clarification so we can work together, so that it is clear about who is providing what kind of service, what's their training, what's their licensure, if at all, what's their credentials. So just to touch upon briefly the horse-centered conceptualization. I still think there is a way for you to talk specifically about the kind of service you're offering. And however, I think that it is important to be careful, because as soon as you start talking about it with language like horse therapist or horse therapy, or horse-centered therapy, you just added to the confusion, because what kind of service is that really? If what you're offering is therapy, and therapy is defined as with a licensed therapist, whether we're talking PT, OT, speech, counselor, recreational therapist, if you're offering therapy, you need to be talking about the profession of what type of therapy you're offering. Don't get me wrong, the horse is an amazing being. And the horse brings things to these sessions that a dog doesn't bring, a second human doesn't bring. It's amazing and wonderful. But if you are providing therapy, it's the therapist that is bringing the framework to do the work. And the horse is bringing him or herself to help with that work, which is why, going back to the terminology group, the consensus was to use equine assisted as opposed to equine facilitated, because the therapist utilizes their training and their profession to provide that session while bringing the horse into it for the horse to bring what they bring to the session. Just as a therapeutic riding instructor or an adaptive riding instructor is going to bring their training, particularly around safety, into the arena for a horsemanship lesson or a therapeutic riding lesson. And I guess I don't know if this is in anyone's thoughts, and I know stuff has been going on in the chat, but I can't read it or I'll completely lose my train of thought. The instructor brings what they know, what they've learned, what they've been trained for, and their credential says they're capable of doing. And that is a very different experience than an individual going in and trying to tack up a horse with no instruction and no guidance. Now, do I think that there is therapeutic value in interacting with a horse? I do. But there's a difference between therapy and therapeutic value and what kind of goals you're looking for. Because I can call a horse my therapy horse, because when I walk into that stall and I have this connection with the horse, I feel better.
Just about a minute, Kathy, you've got.
Got it. I feel better. But I'm not getting therapy. I do feel better. So my experience is there are some things innately therapeutic about interacting with a horse, but that is very different than therapeutic or therapy goals that are guided by trained professionals. And I'm going to end by reiterating, all of this is why I do think how we talk about this is so very important, and that over and above everything else, you are very specific about what you're offering. And that's it for now.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I really loved you differentiating between therapy and therapeutic value. For me, that's like a really key piece in this conversation. To the other panelists, Veronica and Bettina, do you have a preference for who's coming next?
I'd like to go next, if that's okay, Bettina.
Either
Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I have a background in the corporate world and also a mental health practitioner. And so this conversation is always really interesting to me. And what I'm really fascinated by is that looking on the screen, I can see so many of you who've been in this field for a really long time, names that I recognize. And so there's a curiosity in me about what is it that you are wanting to from this conversation. You know, you've been part of these negotiations, navigating this process for a really long time. And so, I'm curious about that, and I wanted to name it. And also, just listening to what you were saying just now, Kathy, and Nina, your conceptualization, kind of pulling all the different threads together. What's really striking me in this moment is how we so often in these conversations focus on, what is therapy and what isn't. And Kathy, your point about being really clear about what it is you're offering, based on what training you have and experience that you have, I think is critical. Because in my experience, there's almost like a hierarchy that has been established, where it feels like mental health is better than education or coaching. And for me, it's just very different. There are different skills, different experiences. And when we talk about scope of practice isn't simply whether you're licensed or not. It's whether you have the experience or not. And so for somebody who is a licensed mental health practitioner, who goes out then to offer team building with organizations, and they've never worked within an organizational setting, that is outside of scope of practice. In the same way as if an organizational consultant started offering horse therapy. So yes, being really clear about the language, but also knowing what your own limits are and being honest about what skills you have, I think helps to clarify for your client population and the community that you're serving what it is that you are there to do. And going hand in hand with that is, as a practitioner, whether I'm working with a corporate environment or whether I'm working in a mental health setting, for me, the ethical piece is, do I have consent to do what it is that I am intending to do with this particular client? So when I step into an organizational space as a mental health practitioner, I don't have consent to do therapy. I don't have consent to ask the types of questions that I would naturally lean towards if I'm working as a therapist in a session. And, if I am in the same way as if I'm working as a therapist, I'm not going to start offering organizational consulting to my clients. That seems a little bizarre to even think about. And yet there's something I think that needs to be bridged when we talk about scope of practice, that is that intersectionality of conceptualization and language and experience. So for me, I kind of see it as like a, Venn diagram. What is that intersectionality piece that allows me to do my job and to do it well and to do it within my scope of practice and to be clear about what it is that I'm doing? And I think that then when we think about it in those terms, we can then look, zoom out a little bit and kind of say, okay, so if we can be clear about all these things, then what is the impact of that? And the impact of that might be, okay, we need to be clearer about the specific type of research that we're doing here. The number of dissertation committees that I've been invited to be part of, and Nina, I'm sure you get this too, is, when someone will contact me and say, I'm doing my dissertation and I'm going to do research on equine therapy for the efficacy with working with veterans, and then they pull from literature everything that's to do with therapeutic riding. then we have a really confused baseline to go off of from a research perspective. And so then from the research then, as educators within an academic space, that impacts how we teach and what information we can draw on. So I think all of these things are so interconnected that we need to find that sweet spot where we know individually and then collectively where we sit within the field. And I'm using the word field rather than industry, because it feels to me to be a broader perspective. And also I do acknowledge that this is an industry, in the sense of it's a very specific population of people that are drawn into doing this work and are marketed to and create businesses from. So from that sense, I do think that it is an industry. So even in those nuanced differences in language, I think being clear and naming what it is that you are offering and maybe offering an explanation of why you are positioning yourself from that space based on your own experiences will help to educate the public on what it is that they're coming to you for. So I think I have maybe a minute left.
Yeah, 2 minutes left.
Okay. And so I think really what I would like to challenge us within this field is looking at, our own perceptions of and biases, perhaps, of where we think we fit in these spaces, and do we hold some kind of superiority about being in the mental health setting versus in a coaching or educational setting? And if so, how can we shift that to recognize that these are just very different skills? And if we can focus on the skills that's required to do what it is that we are offering in our services, then maybe that will become clearer to the public. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Veronica. I really love that you brought that the hierarchy and that, we need to get more curious about skills so that we can become clearer in the terminology. Thank you. Bettina, are you ready? Yeah.
Sure. My name is Bettina Schultz-Job. I just realized I should have renamed myself from the beginning, but I'm with Natural Lifemanship. I'm the CEO of Natural Lifemanship and co-founder. My husband and I founded it in 2010. I've so appreciated these conversations. I watched I wasn't able to be on the last call, but I watched it. And I love this conversation. I really appreciated that Jane said in the beginning, though, that it can be divisive and it can feel heated. And I've in some ways getting to go last feels great because I can ditto what everybody said, right? This also is hard because I've had lots of thoughts all the way through, which makes it now I'm like, oh, what am I going to talk about? But one of the things have thought about, been thinking about a little bit is the reason why it feels so heated. And this came up on the last call a little bit. And I think it was Lynn Thomas who was saying, why do we care about this conversation, right? Like, what is the reasons that we do that? And she gave a couple different reasons why that feels important. And it becomes heated for the people who are licensed and are offering this work. That feels heated for them, but it becomes heated on the other end too. And so we haven't spoken a lot to that today. So I thought maybe I'd take a stab at this, the other ways that we're incorporating horses that may not fit or doesn't feel like it fits in a lot of the terminology we're talking about, right? And so I am a licensed professional counselor. I'm glad I have that degree. I've loved having that degree. And I've had training in many, many, many modalities that are available to people who are not therapists. So like somatic experiencing and somatic movement and TRE. And I mean, lots of these modalities are, people are not therapists and are then trained in them and might be doing similar work to some of the work that I do, right? So without necessarily going into, oh, but why is it the therapy different? It's that I wonder if there isn't benefit in using I've also really appreciated the optimal terminology paper. Our organization spent a lot of time with it when it first came out. We wrote a summary, we wrote a response, we've done our best to integrate it into our work and our languaging. And one of the areas where I have been curious about is we talk a lot about the therapy first language. And I understand that as a therapist, right? Even with therapy first language though, I'm not always educating the consumer well. Because licensed professional counselor or mental health counseling and partnering, integrating, working with, however you want to do this, bringing horses to that mix is still not really descriptive, because the way I work as a mental health therapist may look completely different than somebody else who's doing like amazing work. And just down the street, many people on this call are doing amazing work, but our work will look different. It's still not descriptive, right? So what I wonder is, even in the learning field, could we lead with the profession, lead with what we're doing? You know, we have people in natural lifemanship. I just had a call yesterday with somebody who is a shamanic practitioner, and she has been doing shamanic journeying for 20 years, and she's doing amazing work. I've loved learning that from her, and she's integrating horses into that, right? Well, her marketing leads with the shamanic work. And the other, she's also been trained in various energy practices, including, you know, Reiki and Masterson method. And she's doing lots of energy work in the work that she does. Her marketing still should lead with that. So people know what Veronica was talking about. We're all mentioning consumers, right? A lot of this is to protect consumers. This conversation matters to me because I feel like consumers need to know what they're signing up for and do the best to get the services that they need, right? And so such powerful work is done with people who are yoga instructors and are integrating horses into the work that they're doing as a yoga instructor or a trauma sensitive yoga instructor. There are people from so many different modalities. And I feel like some of the heated conversation on the other side is people who have an enormous amount of training, right? And an enormous amount of training in something that doesn't fit under what we see as the normal medical model, right? And so that's when we then start having all these arguments, it seems, right? About, is it science or is it intuition or is it, and I think I read that and I think, could we do both? Because for me, it's all about integration. So in my mind or in my experience, the science and like a lot of the traditional healing practices, a lot of things that seem to be more intuitive in nature, science is confirming those all the time. So I don't feel like it's that we're doing this. I've seen conversations where we hear is the science taking us away from the more intuitive practices. And my experience in this field over the last 15 years has been completely opposite. It's that I feel like the science is what's bringing us to these. All of a sudden we go, oh my goodness, look at this. You know, I in close relationship. I'm thinking about shamanic journeying just because that was a conversation I had yesterday. I go, oh my goodness, so many similarities between that and EMDR, for example, a modality. that I'm trained in, and psychodrama, another modality I'm trained in, right? And so I start to see where there's this overlap and it comes together, and that we can care about the science and as a way of legitimizing our field. And we can also become passionate about, because science does point to the intuition, right? It's the science of attachment, for example, that points us to things like our own body regulation and what is meant by, we use all these big words, right? It's what's meant by co-regulation. It seems to me that the science is bringing us back to some pretty good common sense in many ways about how we raise children, about how we interact with horses, about what's happening in my nervous system and the nervous system of those around me, right? And so I do think language is really, really important. I care about it. I do think how we describe what we do matters. I think the language we use matters in how we market ourselves. It matters in how people find us on the internet. I mean, when you start getting into things like SEO of our website and things like that, the language does matter, right? And I love exactly what Veronica said, which is it's not a hierarchy, right? Offering, mental health counseling is not more important than cranial sacral therapy. They're separate. And there is some overlap at times where we might both be working on the nervous system, right? The conversation starts to feel so muddy when we're trying to figure out what is mental health and what is not, right? Because then, I'll hear people say, well, therapy is when we are, therapy means that we're maybe processing past trauma and trying to see, if that's affecting the present. And I love, that's my love, right? Is processing, the processing of memory and images and past trauma. I love to do that, but that's not only what's therapy. And we'll talk then about life skills. Well, emotional regulation is one of the life skills that falls under the learning category. And as a therapist, I certainly care all the time about emotion regulation. If you're not doing that, you're not doing good therapy or maybe anything else, right? So there's going to be overlap, and maybe I know I've got 1 minute left, right? Is that right? Two. Maybe I have 2 whole minutes. So maybe the conversation is less in some, I don't know, in an effort, like we want to not be divisive and we also want to be clear, right? And so I feel like we keep coming back to, and this came up on the last call, we've been discussing this today, is it's about doing our own work enough so that we can work within our scope of practice. Because I don't think scope of practice is about what's the experience you have, but it's also about being able to listen to your own body and know deeply what your strengths are and what your challenges are, and when you need to refer out, and when you need more supervision or consultation and more education. And your body tells you which direction to go with that, right? So much of it's about being able to do our own work so we can work within our scope of practice, and so that we can describe it, be clear about it, lead with what it is we're offering that we're then bringing the horses into, right? And again, I could hit this one later, but this whole horse-centered versus client-centered, in some ways, I think, clinical, horse issues are clinical issues. They're so deeply intertwined, right? And so it's so many ways that we conceptualize something to teach it, when in practice, we start seeing this happening. And that's where things are not so black and white. It's where it's hard. We have to break things apart to conceptualize and talk about them. And then there's a point at which when we start really doing the work, we notice some of this starting to happen. And as long as we're learning to be attuned and be compassionate and be sensitive and be regulating our own bodies, the more we're able to do all of that, the more when this happens, we don't start feeling threatened and feeling divisive, I guess, is maybe where I'll end. So yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here, by the way. And thank you, Lee, for doing this.
Thanks so much, Bettina. Thanks so much for Yeah, just again, talking about that overlap. And I think that's what it's a huge part of our field, that overlap. And it does make it really confusing for how we can all meet and how we can all get clear. Because like you say, we need to break things apart, which can create that division. And but it's like, I feel like we keep getting stuck as a field. So how do we kind of be able to break things apart and get that clarity when there is that gray area that shows up? So thank you so much, all of our panelists. Leaf, I'll hand over to you.
And I think I will just hand it right over to Callie to move us into Q&A, other than saying same thing. Thank you all so much, panelists. That was delightful and just got us like right to the next place. So take it away, Callie.
Yeah, stunning. There were a couple of questions specifically around like PT and OT that had popped up in the chat. I don't know if those had all been answered or if anybody has questions that they want to ask. I definitely have one I could ask, but I don't want to put it out unless there's going to be chirps otherwise. So does anybody either in the chat or right now have a question they'd like to ask our panelists?
Make sure to unmute yourself.
Okay, Bettina, my question, oh, sorry, did I jump the gun? Leaf, you kind of said,
Oh, sorry, I was just going to ask, it's
yeah.
Deanna. I'm an OT in Australia. Yeah, you know, I still wonder where OTs, PTs, when you talk about the equine assisted learning, equine assisted mental health, it seems like a dichotomy, you know, the two. And I'm always like, yeah, but where do we fit in? Like, it's kind of like, should there be equine assisted allied health? Because it's kind of like, well, we do a bit of both really, and we're an in-betweeny sort of thing. And I mean, does it matter that we don't fit into the two? But I still think, should there be another subgroup, equine assisted allied health? Did you hear me?
I think the
yeah.
panelists are just taking it in. Any panelists want to speak to that?
I'm happy to speak to it just a little bit, maybe. I'll jump in quick, Deanna, and try to jump out though. You know, and this was one of the, in the optimal terminology paper, it was one of the things that natural lifemanship felt like, well, wait a minute, because we know in our organization, we have a lot of OT and PT as well that are learning to integrate horses in this way, right, to the work that they do. And so we still felt like a blanket term that had equine assisted therapy, because you're an occupational therapist, a physical therapist. You still have a license to offer the work. We still felt like there needed to be some sort of blanket term to talk about this sort of EAT, right? And that underneath that, then all of these different types of therapies exist. Now I realize I know understand the limitations in that, but we're sort of continuing to play with that, but we still think that an occupational therapist ought to lead with the therapy they're offering, right? Occupational therapy with horse interactions, or however you end up saying that, right? Yeah, I won't stay there for too long though. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just dropped a file into the chat that I find really useful when thinking of healthcare, and kind of for simplicity talking about healthcare as OT-PT speech and mental health for the super simplistic reasons here today. Because I agree with you, Bettina, that I think that healthcare as a unit has a lot of commonalities. And I noticed that when working on the conceptualization paper for psychotherapy, because the same structural way of thinking is in fact what is proposed by the American Hippotherapy Association, of which I am a board member, just as an FYI. But you know, we're not, this group is specifically more for mental health and education. But anyway, I think a lot about healthcare. I think a lot about healthcare aligned terminology, and working, if you work within the medical model of healthcare, then there's a lot of resources also for Deanna and everybody from the American Hippotherapy Association that then helps you when you're licensed to really stay aligned and clear with your colleagues.
And I also dropped into the chat much earlier a terminology guidelines for providers worksheet that a work group from the original terminology work group has stayed together and continued to work on it. And so we put that together, and it's on the PATH International website and is free to anyone if you would find that helpful. To go back to the question, and I may just be repeating what Nina said, therapy, OT is considered part of therapy. You know, that is, it is a particular kind of therapy that is offered here in the States. I'm going to stick there. I know you're in Australia, but it is considered therapy.
Deanna, did that help at all? Where'd you go?
I believe that's a good point in the chat
Yes.
that you put in the chat.
Yeah, well, it seems like there is that, you know, and this may just be Callie for our next call.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Oh, yep.
That was Deanna.
That was Deanna. Kathy, this also just, and Callie, this just may be for our next call around really trying to understand what clinical intentionality is, right? And why the therapist in the sort of therapy first model, why the therapist needs to be in the driver's seat versus the horse. And there's some really interesting what Nina, how we started with Nina's conceptualization of like horse-centered versus therapy first is, I think, really fascinating, because if you're coming from a standpoint where you aren't a therapist providing therapy by underneath the medical model, using all those terms, all the things that means, then it can be hard to have an orienting principle, right? Like a thing that you're like, oh, this is what I do. If the horse is sort of first and the horse is the one guiding the session or leading the session or facilitating the session, then what are you? What are you? Are you the horse's support staff? You know, are you the horse's, what are you in relation to the client and to the horse? Whereas the therapy first language says, I think, and Nina and all of the rest of you panelists can agree or disagree with that, but my sense is that with the therapy language first, you're saying the therapist is the one making the decisions, guiding the session. Now, granted, the horse is going to have all sorts of things to say about what happens, but you know, the job of the therapist becomes, you know, kind of understanding what therapeutic content or how you turn that into use clinical intentionality, do something with whatever the horse is actually presenting. Whereas if the horse is first, then the therapist, or I mean, the person that's not a therapist is doing what, for what reason? So I think that those are really good questions for us to explore and understand more around. The therapy first is sort of maybe like clearer or kind of almost easier in a way. But if you're not doing that, then what are you doing, and how does that work, and what does that look like, and how do you describe it, and how do you conceptualize it?
Leaf, it's Pam.
Hi, Pam.
What are we doing? We're totally in this call talking about therapy, and what we're doing is facilitating. That's the word. And there are different ways of facilitating each one of these modalities. So there are different ways of facilitating equine assisted learning, and there are different ways of facilitating psychotherapy incorporating horses. And we can explore that. But it's about facilitation and the difference in the facilitation. And that's what Veronica spoke to, that if you're a therapist going into workplace training, which is why I helped to form E3A, because I knew that you could not go into workplace and treat it like, you know, a family group process. It's workplace training. So you need to know what those things are and have those skills to facilitate in a proper manner. So it's not just about doing therapy, it's about facilitating if you're going to have a horse involved.
And maybe that's exactly where the difference is that, you know, if we put ourselves in that role of we are the facilitators of whatever the experience is, then it falls back into all the things our panelists have been talking about around what are we facilitating, right?
Exactly. And how are we facilitating, right?
Yeah, all of that stuff. So I'm going to be quiet now, because I'm sure there are other people that want to talk, and I know we're also running late. So I realize people may need to drop off, and we'll wrap up here in a couple minutes. So sorry, Callie, take it away.
No, I think that's great. And I think my question has mostly been answered too. So anybody else have anything that they'd like to bring up?
Or panelists, any last things you guys want to say before we wrap up? Or Jane or Callie?
I just saw Veronica put something in the chat that I think is super important for me anyway. And she's kind of said, perhaps it would help to step away from thinking about what you're allowed to do in terms of therapy or not, but what is the impact on clients when you are working outside of your scope of practice, experience, training? For example, if offering services for veterans with PTSD but have no training or experience in working with veterans or trauma. And I just love that she's really kind of brought it right back to, for me, what we need to really be thinking about is how are we impacting the people we're working with, and also the horses that were involved in the work we're doing as well. That was, I just thought it was a really important point.
Yeah, and briefly to add to that, to me, that then speaks to this idea that it becomes skill centered, like the human skill, because otherwise we might feel drawn to saying, well, of course I can work with veterans because it's actually my horse that does the work. And then, and again, I want to come back to that this is not meant to be a value hierarchy here between the conceptualizations, but just point out that we might have a tendency to think in a certain way. We might have a tendency to say, yeah, it's okay. Of course, I can work with different kinds of people because the horse brings it all together and the horse makes it so. Versus then, you know, the idea that Jane highlighted from Veronica, which is, you know, I have to know that I as a human can work with these folks in a particular way, and that I bring the horse in to kind of enhance or add to that process, but that my process with the human is built on a good foundation. I think that could also be kind of understood in terms of that impact as well.
Yes. Amazing. Such an amazing, rich conversation. Thank you all so much. And what we're going to do next, I think, Jane and Callie, I think we're going towards even another level deeper, which is to explore, well, what does this look like in practice, you guys? Like everyone, all of our panelists, Bettina, you just said it, you know, beautifully at the end there, of like the real rub comes in this, right? In the moment where you're out there doing it, and it all kind of blends together. And what are you doing? And how do you do what Nina just said and Jane brought up? And, you know, like so much. How do we catch ourselves when our hearts are big and we want to, and we've been touched by a horse and we want to give that to someone else? And where do we stop, and where do we know our limits, and where does it switch between we're doing something that's actually healthy and good for somebody, and we're actually doing something harmful without ever knowing that the switch occurred, you know? So I think that's where we're wanting to move to in these conversations, is what would that even look like? How would we even know? And what does it look like in practice? So we're hoping you guys will join us for more of these, and what a total treat. So thank you to our panelists, to Callie and Jane, and to all of you for being with us through this journey. So I think we're good, unless Callie or Jane has anything else to add. Okay, great.
I'm just very grateful for the conversation, and yeah, for all that all of you have brought. Thank you so much.